the scenes, all the planning was done by Candace.
in high school for running the 800 meter, the 1 mile and 2 mile. That record still stands at Iowa School for the Deaf. I hope that my daughter would beat that record when she gets older. That would be my dream, is for her to beat that record for me. So I'm training my daughter to be a runner so she can break my
And do you
record.
still run?
No, obviously not so much of a runner these days. You could see, and you could, have a knee issue as well. But that's a little bit about me. All right, I'll turn it over to my next panelist.
Okay. Now, another question for you. For the next panelist, tell me your name, the name of your tribe, whether it is federally recognized tribe, and three fun facts about you. Hello, my name is Cindy Martin, signed in this way. And the reason my sign name is done this way is because I love meeting others, and as I've raised children and community in my Indigenous community, and the deaf Indigenous community has been very dear to me. So, as I'm a writer and poet, and I write daily. I am Anishinaabe, signed in this way. And let's see, we're recognized. The Red Lake Reservation is federally recognized in Minnesota. Now, let's see, three fun facts about me. I'm going to have to think on that. There's a lot that I could say, but oh, you know what? I will say I have two beautiful children. I have a daughter who's 25 and a daughter who's 19. And I'm part of the Red Lake Nation, and they're going to Red Lake Nation University now. And she's decided to join the military, which is really tugging at my heartstrings, but she wants to go and do the work. And my son is in high school now and soon to go to college. And he loved doing Muay Thai. So those are things I love about my kids. Let's say three facts about me. Well, as Sarah said, talked a lot about her kids. Let's see, broken records. I've got one. I broke a school record at a public mainstream school. And so nobody broke that record for some 6 years, but the record I broke was for shot put. And that record, my name is still there in the Hall of Records there. So I'm very excited and happy about that. Let's see, another one. I'm the first person in my family to have gone to college. I didn't complete it, but it's in process. And let's see, the third thing. I love sports. Back in the day, when all the other girls were making makeup, doing makeup, and getting their frills together, I was who I am, and I like my makeup, I like my hair, my nails done, I like it all, but still very much an athlete, love sports.
Now, are you currently employed or are you retired?
I'm not retired yet. That's down the road. I'm working on being a coordinator for
Designated order.
a designated order, working with mental health issues with deaf and deafblind people, and I've been doing that for a number of years now. I'm a mental health practitioner and supervisor. And I manage client needs, make sure that my clients' needs are met, especially those that aren't generally met in systems that are not designed for deaf and deafblind and deaf and hard of hearing people. Right now, I am also a deaf interpreter for IIO, the Indigenous Interpreters Organization, working with Sarah Youngberg Brown here, and wonderful people there. And let's see, I am working towards growing my career, and I always love working with other Indigenous deaf people. And those are my aspirations right now.
Thank you so much. Now to our final panelist. Do you mind sharing a bit about your background, who you are, which tribe you come from, the intersecting identities that you might have, some information about work, about your family, similar questions that the previous panelists responded to.
Sure. Just wait for the next slide to come up. The camera to pan over. Okay. Hello, everybody. So my name is Mike. My last name is Bird. I'm from Virginia. However, I am Native American. I'm from the Rappahannock tribe, as well as the Powhatan. And my daughter, well, actually, I'm third and fourth in line from a family of Powhatan. So, I mean, I've been using ASL, or I've been teaching ASL for almost 30 years. Retired now. A spiritual leader now. Part of my time these days is teaching, and I do have a knee replacement that I'm dealing with, which is a recent thing for me, trying to stay positive. My wife got me this particular cane for support. My wife is Canadian. She is also Native American, and she's Cree Nation, which sorry about my signing. I do have arthritis in my hands as well. So Virginia recently has been recognizing Native American lands. It's been recognized by the state of Virginia for many, many years. I'm 60 years old, actually, and it was recognized federally 8 years ago, and it started with one particular um, Patonki, that particular tribe. And then the Rappahannock was recognized, Mesopotami, and in total, 9 or 10, were federally recognized as a result. So we're really, really thrilled that this is something that's finally been righted historically after years of oppression, and I'm very, very proud to be able to say that myself. So in Virginia, I mean, that's where my home base has been and where I've been, and I consider myself a teacher. My wife is a social worker. However, now she is quote unquote at home. We both, you know, have done lots of different, tours, and these days now we are, relaxed these days. So we have our dogs and our birds and our animals. And I think that is pretty much the gist of what I'm doing these days. Thank you. Thank you. So our other panelist unfortunately couldn't come today. She's unfortunately feeling unwell. Her name is Judy Stout, and she is from the Lumbee tribe. And unfortunately, she couldn't be here today. And as I mentioned before, my name is Daniel Moreno Lucero, and I'm from New Mexico. And I'm Navajo on my grandfather's side and Apache on my mother's or my grandmother's side. However, we've, through this life, I've embraced the Navajo way of life. I went to New Mexico School for the Deaf, graduated in a mainstream school, actually, and they provided interpreting services, and I was excited to go there because of that. So my role model growing up as a Navajo were my grandparents, really because my mother, my young mother, while she was a young mother, I saw that my grandparents took care of me as I was growing up. They told me stories about my Navajo way of life. The more I delved into that way of life, it became my addiction. I decided to follow, the red road, the old Native American road, actually. And what that means actually is following Native customs, using the drums, the and really just not following the white man's way, not using the white man's medicine, following our own path. And that's where I've learned all the lessons of my life. Why? I've been sober now for 50 years. You know, my role model for sober living have been my brothers and sisters out there who have also struggled with addiction as well. So my goal is to be a role model to show that if I can do this, if I can, live the straight and narrow life, I can, show others that they can do the same. So I'm a teacher for 25 years. Now I'm the director of um, employment.
Employment.
I work as a employment spatial placement specialist in DCRC in Idaho. So DCRC is the Deaf Community Resource Center there in Idaho. It's a nonprofit organization. So what I do there is I make sure that all of our adults, our students, that they're all paying taxes. That's my goal. So today, I have some questions that I'd like to ask our panel. So I'm going to turn it now to our panel and start asking some questions here.
So if you can share what your positive or negative experiences have been as an Indigenous person, a Native American, as you navigate language and culture within your family. So if you can share those experiences. And we know that America typically follows these societal standards. And so I would also like to gain your perspective on these narratives or these counter narratives that you have.
I'm just trying to think. So positives and negatives, huh? I mean, growing up at a school for the deaf, I mean, I should back up. I taught at I taught at Gallaudet. I taught at other community colleges. So I've seen positive and negatives. I've seen a lot of oppression through the years. Through my identity as a Native American, I've experienced that oppression. Also at schools for the deaf, at Hampton. I remember in the 1970s, these schools for the deaf were actually segregated, and they were actually, it was actually different than the hearing schools, which were desegregated in the 1960s. But at the schools for the deaf, they weren't desegregated until the 1970s. They're still in denial about that quite a bit, actually. Not the black school for the deaf, but I'm talking about the school for the deaf generally. I've seen a huge difference today. There's much more sensitivity to that, much more recognition of that. For example, when I lead spiritual prayers at the time, I've seen a huge difference from my time now, from the time I entered at 1982 until now. I mean, in 1982, there was so little recognition. So that's, I think, a negative, certainly. I had a friend who, was very, very much a believer in, talking about that, and became a teacher and was really fighting for me and really to go through that with my family here at Gallaudet. And that was a negative experience until looking at it today. There's so much more recognition today. There's so much more sensitivity. And that's a huge difference from the 1980s until 2025 now. There's a huge, huge shift that I've seen. At schools for the deaf today, I would say that they're more sensitive today, but probably not as well. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of oppression that still happens. Today, I haven't visited a school for the deaf. So, I mean, yeah, I've showed my wife and kind of mentioned that to her and tried to tell her some stories about what I've seen. But my experience here at Gallaudet has been positive. My experience back when I was younger at schools for the deaf were very negative. Were very raw to me. Yeah, I think it's very, very hard when you think about the religious perspective. I mean, I'm very thankful in that sense, but there was a lot of oppression that happened between, religious groups and their treatment of Native Americans. Um, and now, in terms of Thanksgiving, I mean, I think it's important to educate people as well as enjoy the the holiday.
And what about the sign for Indigenous?
Yeah, these are the signs I've seen, and they're fine. My wife and I have mentioned, and my wife and I still use the sign for Indian. I have no issue using that sign. I'm in full support of using that sign, keeping in mind that you're using it neutrally, openly, and with respect.
Sarah, do you want to tell us a little about your background? Sure. I'd be happy to. I've got a lot to share. So I'm very thankful for my upbringing and to my family, to my mother and the hearing members of my family. I'm very thankful for them for learning to sign. And as soon as they knew I was deaf, they began to learn sign. And they went to the Agency for the Education of Deaf People locally, and they had a teacher come from community college who came and gave face-to-face lessons to the family so that they could learn to sign. And from the time that I was 8 months old, my whole family started signing, and I'm very grateful for that. And my family is Meskwaki, as I said, and they come from originally the East Coast, the New York area, Massachusetts area, and New Jersey area. But then they were migrated all the way to the Wisconsin area and Illinois and Iowa, where they settled. And so they traveled the waterways and lakes through the St. Lawrence area and carried the stories of our history and our religion along that migration. And I'm very grateful for that. The Meskwaki people still practice the old ways, the ways of our ancestors, and we still use our language, and we still practice our old ceremonies. We're still very much involved in our roots there. And the family learned to sign to communicate with me. And when we go to the feasts there, my family would always cook for the feasts, and I would be called to be part of that. I was not shunted to one side. I was always involved with the family and the traditions. They made sure I understood our people. And are you all familiar with the notion of two-spirit people? Yes. Okay. So there was a two-spirit person who taught me a great deal about the rules of our people, the ways of our people, and the ways in which we should practice. So, for example, when I was menstruating, I was not to eat with my family. I was to be go to a place aside and eat uh, alone. And we still practice that. And when a family member has died, we still treat them in the old way. We don't go with caskets, churches, and those kinds of things. We still go to a bear den, the Bear Clan, correction of the interpretation. We go there and we engage in our worship and the ways of the Meskwaki people, and we pray to the Creator.
Uncle John.
Uncle John, who was my father figure, Uncle John, would always sit with me and make sure that I understood the ways and rituals of our people. He would say, you don't eat fish. And so my Indian name is actually of the Fish Clan. And so remember, we have 574 tribes across the US, but we also have clan systems that are not are pan-Indian. They don't belong to every tribe, and those clans are among the different tribes. So we have 7 clans in ours, and my Indian name is Titi Kami Gaya, which means woman stands on the edge of the river of the fish clan. And my 2 children also have their Indian names. My son's name is Old Fishman, and my daughter's name, Water Woman. And I'm very involved with my family and my tribe. And now my daughter is doing the same thing. And my family can sign with my deaf daughter. And that makes me so very happy. Her grandparents, her aunts and uncles can communicate with her. My daughter is so fortunate to be in a family that signs, that preserves our languages, and that continues our ways generation upon generation and into the future. We take pride in our culture, our language, and our way of life. We embrace it. So many have lost their languages along the way and have barely held on to them. Well, there's 574 tribes, right? And there's 574 languages that should be honored and cherished. And so many have been lost along the way. Millions and millions of people have been lost. And so the fact that we are today here where we are says that we are survivors, that we carry on. Now, as for Thanksgiving, obviously I don't celebrate Thanksgiving. My mother taught me about Thanksgiving, and when I learned its history, I said, no, no more will I celebrate it. This is an artificial holiday. And I think it's silly to honor a holiday that celebrates the killing of our people. And of course, I would not celebrate Thanksgiving from the time I learned about it onward, ever. And if you know more about Thanksgiving and its roots, stand up for what you know. And if you want to know more, you can look it up and find that history.
And now, Cindy, if you can share your response to the similar questions.
So I grew up in Minneapolis, and there are a great many indigenous people that do live there in that area. And my parents moved there originally for work, leaving the reservation, moving into this area. And there are many Dakota, Lakota, and Anishinaabe people there. And when I became deaf, I was very young, 2.5 years old, when I fell ill and became deaf. When my family found out I was deaf, somebody came to teach my family sign, which was wonderful. And so as this young child, my mother decided I was going to go off to the school for the deaf. And I was very excited. I thought, I was going to go and be friends with all of these deaf people. And my siblings said, go and good luck with your sign language school. And I went, and it really was the school of hard knocks. It was very difficult. I experienced a great deal of racism and trauma. And I begged my mother to come home, told her I didn't want to go to that school anymore, that I didn't like the kids there. And the school system and the way it was run was no good for me. Finally, my dad decided to bring me closer to home, bring me back home so that I could be with my family again. And I loved my people. I loved seeing them. And all of the trauma of being colonized, of the language deprivation and the loss of language and all of that, it was so traumatic. And I carried that with me. And my family understood me. My family knew me for who I was. And as a deaf person, I was always very forthright with my family about signing what you say and tell me what you're laughing about. Of course, we've all had that experience as deaf people, but I was very much somebody who could speak up and say, tell me what you're saying, tell me what you're laughing about. And my 2 sisters were amazing. They would always interpret for me, always tell me what was happening. And when I got involved with the community, went to powwows, I loved the experience of being at the powwows. The music, the drums speak to my soul. They speak to my culture and they tell me I'm home. And when I go to ceremony, I would always be with them. And my sisters would interpret for me, tell me what the elders were saying. But the one thing that I would say was deprived of is, in terms of culture and traditions and language, my family doesn't know how to do some of our traditional crafts. And then many years later, when I left, I came back, and then I could see a change and a revitalization in our Indigenous community, learning to mend our traditional clothing, the ribbon skirt that I have now, all of that. I love that that is true now, and that we have our traditional crafts, our traditional beadwork, and can speak in the spoken language of Lakota, Dakota, and Anishinaabe. Those are coming back. People are teaching the languages again, and that is so wonderful. It's beautiful to see the decolonization that is happening among our people, and that's why Indigenous interpreters are so important. That helps to further the work of decolonization. We need not feel controlled by the other any longer. And the sign, the Indigenous sign, is important to us because that's our home. Our home is in our Indigenous sign language. And I never liked the word Indian growing up. I hated it because that comes from the people that created the system that colonized us. So I would not claim that word. Now, okay, for Thanksgiving. Well, as I said, that comes from an experience of colonization. My family says that there's a time for family together and friends together. And some will offer thanks, some will not. But for me, in my family, we never say Happy Thanksgiving. No, we gather with friends and family that are very close, and that's it.
Yeah. So in terms of Thanksgiving, it is very much an American thing, right? Me personally, I don't celebrate Thanksgiving as well. However, I do say happy feast. I will say that because that particular phrase tends to infer or tends to talk about family getting together and being together. So for me, saying happy Thanksgiving should just be changed with just by saying happy feast. I mean, for me, I think it's an empowering way to change language. And instead of saying Thanksgiving, just to ingrain that in people's minds instead of Thanksgiving. If someone were to say to you, Happy Thanksgiving, I mean, how would you respond, I guess?
I'd get mad.
And I guess for me, I wouldn't say anything. I would just keep my mouth shut.
Well, yeah, and the camera wasn't on me, but I would say I would definitely be mad. No,
Okay. And for you, what about this question? Well, I mean, relating to that comment that Sarah made about going to a school for the deaf and experiencing oppression, I mean, I remember being mocked for having mixed heritage. I remember experiencing that. And then I remember asking my mom, saying, you know, these teachers, aren't, they tell me I'm not Indian. And, I remember asking my sister, I said I was sad and what should I do? And my sister really emphasized that you are Native American. And then growing up, I mean, all the powwows I went to, and I mean, I don't know. After that experience, my experience at my school for the deaf, it was ingrained in me, and later my mother called that teacher and talked to her. And after that, that teacher came up to me and apologized to me. And, you know, that particular school for the deaf did have issues historically. And growing up, I mean, I did see them. My parents didn't want to send me to that school for the deaf. Their whole family in the 1960s are also Native American. My uncle or her uncle was a teacher at the time. And, I'm curious how many people here know what the Loving couple is? Do you know that particular couple in Virginia? That's actually very close to where I grew up. There was an issue there, really a lot of issues in regard to heritage and Native Americans and cultural conflicts and interracial marriages. I mean, the Loving couple was the couple that was a dark skinned couple and a dark skinned man and a white woman and I mean, my family, we have some who are half black, half Indian. There are many. I mean, I'm fully mixed, but my uncle knew that my uncle knew the Loving family, and family is buried in the same Terry that they're buried in. Just so you know. So they're buried in the same place, and it's a mixed cemetery right there. So through the years, I got a chance to know more and more through my uncle. My uncle is a teacher, and he, knows a lot about the different birthday years and the all the history. I that stuff, but my uncle does. He was able to write all that down, and my sister actually is also an interpreter as well. And after that, my aunt would also tell lots of stories as well and became more inclusive. Things got better from the 1960s onwards, and I think I don't know, that's kind of encapsulates my negative experience. But my family was always there culturally. I mean, family traditions were always there. It didn't matter what we were going through; those never changed, and they're still there doing the same things to this day, and that's a very much a positive. Again, my family did very much were raised religious, and they always thanked God, but there was always a different interpretation for that. But my grandmother would always be thankful for what we went through and having gone through it and experienced that and come out the other side. They were strongly positive, and I think church was that for them and really emphasized that. Even though they grew up oral and didn't sign very much, my parents were oral and um, I don't know. So I experienced a lot growing up, and I can't say anything more than that. There was a lot of things that happened during that time, and a lot of murders and the like during the civil rights era. And you know, there's a lot of parallels. Native Americans have gone through, but that tribe was, or our reservation was recognized. And but my grandparents were passed away at that time. We were still there, and our sisters were there. Um, and we just wish that our grandparents were there to see that. Um, yeah, our family or the Rappahannock tribe, we recently had a vote for a new chief, and I was very, very excited to see that we're still going forward. We're still there, and I don't know, access is becoming better and better. We just had a powwow recently, actually before coming here, for a recovery or for a healing blessing and ceremony. So I do see positive things that have happened lately.
Thank you so much for responding to those questions and sharing your experiences. We, as Indigenous peoples, often go through experiences like this. And when we see the word Thanksgiving, we think about genocide. That is normally our immediate thought when we see that word. That's my first response. Now for question number 3. Now, briefly, you mentioned your educational experience. Oh, let's hold on one moment. So there was a question in the audience asking what genocide meant, and what that is the crucial extermination of a community, of a group, an extinction of them.
It means they've been killed and killed until they've been nearly or completely erased.
All right. So now I know a few of you have briefly mentioned your educational experience. If you don't mind going a little bit deeper and sharing your educational background from childhood, whether you went to a deaf residential school, an indigenous school, a mainstream school, in which you were the only deaf person, or perhaps you were among a group of deaf people, then I'd like you to share your experiences in the higher education system. I'd like you to also talk about your challenges and successes as an Indigenous deaf person in deaf education. And lastly, I'd like to ask what inspired you to pursue your current role?
I was a teacher for a long, long time, for about 30 years. And I taught here actually at Gallaudet University. Before that, I was at University of Richmond in Virginia, and I was also at University of Virginia. I also taught at community colleges as well, and I was even a high school teacher before all of that. So, when my parents were divorced when I was little. I should back up. So when my parents and my aunts and my grandparents were trying to figure out what to do with this deaf boy, they saw that there was an oral school in Richmond. They still felt that there was, a disconnect, and they weren't sure if I would be, successful in the future. And there was one particular teacher who was really, really good and great at being positive. And I start to see a lot of him more as I was growing up, and then I went to Gallaudet, and I started to feel, and become much more successful. I had spent some time in Minnesota as well, and I felt like I had very much the wrong framing and the wrong picture in my mind about my future as a deaf person. And I felt more confident with what I could do for myself after I got my education. And that really instilled a sense of positivity. And I've been teaching for a long time. And, I went through the same crisis, trying to find my Native American identity. It was a very difficult process for me being at a residential school for the deaf, and also, trying to determine who I was. When I was in Minnesota, I I felt like I had to go back to my Native American roots, and went to drum circle, and traveled, and I felt more like I finally was in a community that matched who I was as a person. And that's where I, really found myself, and had, a full realization of who I was. For example, I have a fake knee, so I do feel like I've lost a little bit of my identity, in the sense that, I'm struggling with this new identity as somebody who limps or walks with a limp or has this disability. So I still have that identity as a teacher, and I've gone through challenges as I've gone through life. 3 weeks ago, actually, there was a spiritual celebration that was here, and a few people came up to me and they asked me a question. They said, "Do you remember at Gallaudet University, you didn't say much, um, like you didn't like about there wasn't a really strong sense of Indigenous peoples at that time." And they asked me why that was the case at the time, and really, it just wasn't something that was spotlit. It wasn't something that was really shown, and we're all the result of being oppressed in one way or another. So, my wife at the time had finished studying at Gallaudet in the 1990s. She graduated, and I asked her about her experience, and she said that she started to recognize a little bit about her identity, and today she sees much more of a difference today. There's much more of a sensitivity today about different identities, and that's something that I commend. I don't have a negative, viewpoint on the way I grew up. I just have a positive outlook on how far we've come.
Wow. the system has already been put in place, and that leaves us oftentimes with no choice. With that, Cindy, if you don't mind sharing your educational experience, you had mentioned that you were in a residential school, but then you were put into a public school setting. Do you mind explaining that experience?
I am forever grateful to my father for putting me where I went because of my relationship to my father, and the father-daughter relationship is so critical. I grew up happy because of this. I did go to mainstream school with, special ed, and it was a great feeling because I was close to home, and I could see other Indigenous children at school as well, and other diverse students. And that was a real boon to me. That was a very positive experience. And now I remember, getting that identity, but then getting my sense of deaf identity again and looking for that. And that was a process of acceptance for me. In terms of negative experiences, I had lots of bad experiences with white boys that wanted to fight and wanted to be oppressive. And I don't know why. I don't have any answer for them. They weren't any better than me, but they wanted to fight about it. And so, yeah, some of the deaf white boys I had trouble with. And for the teachers, they were much more supportive, telling me I could do anything, be anything I wanted to be, even when I didn't think I could, and I was resistant. Over the years, though, I matured with my senior year of high school. And the teachers were teaching me about the presidents and all of their wonderful accomplishments and history, and I was really over it. Yeah. And I called the teacher out on that. I said, "Why do you teach these old white men over and over again? And these are lies." And I'm just speaking for myself. Like, why? Why don't you teach the indigenous history? Why don't you teach the native history of this land? It's important. And she said, "Oh, okay, then fine. You go to the library and find some books and write a lesson." So sure enough, that's what I did. And I did that all the way through my graduation. I fought for my education. I did. And I did it. I went and I learned the history and I wrote the history and I came to love the history. So after graduation, and my father had passed away, and that was a source of great trauma for me and my family. And I was deeply grieving. And I had a deaf teacher at the time who, remember, I was very, very resistant to believing in myself and, come on, no, there's just nothing I can do. And they kept encouraging me to do and be. And I ended up going to Close Up here in DC in my junior year. So flew here with several other students. We did the sightseeing events and I began to see much more there. I saw that there was a great deal I could do. And so I completed my high school education and didn't really think about college at the time. I cared so much for being with my family. I wanted to stay close to my family. And then eventually I decided it was time to go to college. So I got really assertive because I didn't have the VR help. I didn't have anybody else to go and give me any aid. And I figured I could just do it all on my own and went in and did the research, figured out what I could do, took the test, passed the tests, did everything I needed to do, filled out the application, started taking my classes. And there was this Indigenous woman who came and approached me. And she said, "Come see me there in the Indigenous Students Club." Okay, sure. And this was really so critical to my identity. Absolutely. And I figured, the indigenous identity was something that was already close to me, and my deaf identity came somewhat later. But then this woman saw me and she said, you need to fill out these applications for indigenous people's grants, and it'll make school so much cheaper for me. She really helped me out with that. The indigenous community at that college was so supportive for me, and they were wonderful. And the deaf identity also came with, they had interpreters. They had interpreters offered at that school. And so this was part of my early experience. Let's see. Does that answer your questions? Is there anything else to it?
Now, Sarah, I know that you went to the Minnesota School for the Deaf. Is that correct, or correct me if I'm right?
No, it's the neighbor of Minnesota, just below it.
Ah, Iowa. All right. All right. I stand corrected. My apologies. I was mixing up uh, your background with
Look, you
my.
got us all labeled Minnesotans here. I'll forgive it because I'm moving to Minnesota next month. I'll forgive it.
All right. Well, so then I'm right. Okay. So, Sarah, if you don't mind sharing your educational background. And before that, I can even share a bit about mine. I went to a deaf residential school in New Mexico. And I was blessed with that experience because that experience was so unique. There was actually an Indigenous school right next to the residential school that I was at. And they would share sports, community. We would flirt with the girls that are there. We would commingle at certain art events and other curricular activities. And it was a blessing. That is what upheld my Indigenous identity. We even had to learn Spanish in the classroom, English. Different languages were encouraged for us to learn. And they also emphasized New Mexican identities. But unfortunately, they didn't do a heavy emphasis on our own indigenous community. We had Navajo.
There were Apaches, there were Pueblos, they were all together. And, they really encouraged, well, interpret a correction. They did not encourage us to have that identity. If I was Mexican or if I was Spanish or I spoke Spanish, we'd be provided all kinds of resources. That was very different seeing that. The reason why, of course, goes back to, the colonial system that was set before us. My education system was influenced by that. So when I had entered Gallaudet University, it was a shock for me. I had set up an Indian organization and I was learning so much. And now, in terms of who I am today, I'm very, very thankful to the art school, the Indigenous art school that the IAIA, that particular Indian School for the Arts was a blessing. If it wasn't for IAIA, what would become of us, Indian children? I don't have any idea, but I'm just profoundly thankful to IAIA. And turn it back over to our panel.
A small world. My mother actually graduated from that school from IAIA. Yeah. Yes.
Wow.
Beautiful campus and great opportunity there. So now back to my story. As I said, I grew up and was born on the reservation, and and I was a correction of the interpretation. I went attended mainstream schools, and it was not a good fit. I was there with special needs students, and my mother knew I should be taught with other deaf children, with signing deaf children instead. But the deaf school was some 4 hours away. My mother was concerned about that because I was only 4 years old, and she didn't want to send me off to a residential school so far away. But we went to go visit the deaf school, and I was 4 years old at the time. And I remember coming there. And remember, this is Iowa, and it's an extremely white population. It's probably 90% white. 90% white population in the state of Iowa. So there I come into the school for the deaf, and let me tell you, I was terrified seeing all these white people. I was frightened. I hid myself behind my mom. I wouldn't let them even look at me because I was used to being with my family. I was used to being with my fellow Indigenous people, and then like going off all alone with these people. But then my mom had to make a tough choice about whether to send me to a school for the deaf when I was 5. And obviously, I was just crying rivers at the time. And probably for a whole year of my life, I was living in this dorm, crying a river every night. And it was difficult, but I did grow to love the school. Iowa School for the Deaf was wonderful for me in some ways because they had great teachers, staff, and children that didn't look at me different for being brown so much. They saw me as somebody who was also deaf and had my back. And that felt good. That felt good. They treated me very well there. And so I remember having that experience. And then when I was 7 or 8, I experienced my first encounter with racism. And there's a white kid who was just sticking me, poking me with the stick because I was Indian and said, didn't like Indian people. I don't like Indians and that sort of thing. And I didn't know where this was coming from. I didn't understand why they didn't like me. And I was completely thrown off by that. And they said, they don't like you because you're Indian, which totally upset me. And that was my first encounter with racism. And I didn't even know what the word meant at the time. But I remember some time passing and realizing that I was facing something different here. And I remember the school would talk about the story of the Mayflower and the pilgrims coming over and how wonderful those pilgrims were and how they made friends with the indigenous people who taught them how to grow the crops. And I saw this story time and again and thought, oh, okay, well, so we're friends with the white people, friends with these people, and that have been through history. And then as time passed and I got older, got old enough to, talk to my mom about this, and then I graduated. My mom gave me some books to read and reading about all the lies you were taught in school. And as I started reading that, let me tell you, I was pissed off. I was so unhappy to read this. Like, why did the schools lie to me all of my life? How come none of our history was here in these history books? Why is it all overlooked? Where are my people? I lost it. I was so angry. How come I'd never been taught any of this stuff in my school? Why was my history shunted aside and hidden? How come we didn't know the truth about what the government did to our peoples over so many generations? And why did I live my life this long clueless about it? Many of us had this same experience of being kept from that knowledge, having this knowledge kept secret. And how come the real history of our peoples is not documented? It's not in those history books that you're taught in school. It's all hidden and set aside, hidden. And so then I started to make more vlogs about Thanksgiving, about Abraham Lincoln, about all our indigenous history. Really started learning more about it and doing more research, reading about it. And then, just like Cindy, I'm a lover of history. So I would just do this for all my homework assignments. I would research more about it. I started making vlogs, telling and sharing the stories. And in terms of higher education, I went to the school for the deaf. And then, I'd been in this deaf world all of my life now, and then was seeking more indigenous connection because I wasn't having that. So after graduation, I didn't go straight to college. I stayed home in the Meskwaki area on the reservation with my family, because it was my responsibility to learn the culture and tradition so that I could pass it on. So I knew how to cook the feasts and teach my children our ways. And I would guess I was in my early 20s when I decided to go to school. And I went to the United Tribes Technical College in North Dakota because I wanted to know more about our indigenous world, and had sort of the opposite experience because at the deaf school, my indigenous self was hidden or unrecognized. And when I went into the indigenous school, my deaf self was not recognized because I didn't have interpreters. And I was doing my best to learn through taking notes and sharing notes with friends as best I could. And the teacher called one of my friends who knew some sign language because they had a deaf friend who had died many years past. So they knew a little bit of sign to come and interpret for me. But they were completely inept. And so I just went writing back and forth and got my education as good as I could that way. But it was a very lonely life to live. But I still had the indigenous connection there, but not yet had I seen the marriage of my two worlds. The indigenous self wasn't recognized in the deaf school. And so, in many ways, what I needed in terms of access in the indigenous school wasn't there. For the educational experience, it just wasn't there. So, that was my experience at the indigenous school. And then in the deaf school, I had the opposite experience. So, it's a very mixed bag.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Our educational system overall again, it's not to our advantage, let's just say. Um, my last question, I kind of want to get an answer from everybody, and then what we'll do is we'll have some time for question and answer with our audience. So, our fourth question. So, you know, what I'm, me as an Indigenous person, I've participated with various, whether it be hearing organizations, Indian organizations, deaf organizations. I've also participated as the vice president for an intertribal deaf council way back in the day. And, it was great. I got to set up these organizations, set up events, was very, very much involved in this. And then it actually unfortunately collapsed. That was an organization I was very much involved in. And like I said, that intertribal deaf council, unfortunately, it is no longer, it's disbanded. So it's no longer in existence. Hopefully it will be reestablished again. And if it does, we could better serve our brothers and sisters and our future generations. So now I want to pose a question to our panelists here. What is your participation? Doesn't matter if it's in the hearing community, the deaf community. Can you just talk about your participation in your communities and what that means to you? So, I mean, I talked about this a bit myself in terms of the intertribal deaf council that I was involved with. I was the chair of that organization before, and I was an elder as well. And I've seen changes. I mean, it disbanded, and then we started over again. If you want to connect that type of organization again, I think it ends up causing harm by not being able to address some of the issues that the organization had tried to address. So, for example, there's been established, and we've started over again, and we have to rethink really just the entire system and start thinking about health and indigenous health and healing, interpreter correction, healing, not health. We need to focus on healing and not looking backwards. We need to take one step forward and look ahead. Native Americans, it doesn't matter what issues they may have, whether they be positive, negative, strong, weak. We all need to work together as a team, united for both hearing and deaf Indigenous peoples. Like you mentioned, you were talking about the college you went to. What was it called?
UTTC, United Technical College.
I thought that was amazing. The tribal college, that was an amazing story that I heard, and I think that was an experience that's better for most people.
So I've recently volunteered at Deaf Equity. And I think for about a year, I've been working with them, helping their organization out. And then the deaf community there has good systems for advocacy. They have pretty much what they need. So I felt it was time to turn my attention to the Indigenous deaf community and look to see what I could set up there. I wanted to set up deaf mentorship for the Indigenous community to teach language and culture because that's a must. You cannot do one without the other. It's so critical because the colonization has stolen my children, stolen our language, stolen our stories. And so when I think about my parents putting me in the school for the deaf, I remember when they told me that my grandmother was taken away from her family, forcibly put it into the Indian boarding schools and was traumatized by that. And her language was taken away from her. She spoke Anishinaabe with her family and her elders and was able to hear that. But she didn't want me to go to the school for the deaf because she was so scarred by her own history in the Indian boarding schools. And so she feared for me to go to the boarding schools. But eventually, I mean, she did let me go. But now I work to help deaf Indigenous children and deaf Indigenous women. They need our help. I work to help them in their healing with marital counseling with their husbands. I help them with their healing. And I have worked with indigenous interpreting organizations. It's which is now a business. And we want to respect people's preferred signs. We want to protect, respect people's home areas. And so it's very important that you know what you're doing in those communities. And so I've also gone and given a great many workshops. So Minnesota's been very wonderful. Had us go to the interpreting organizations and give workshops and trainings. I've also been involved with theater a lot, done workshops there. And yeah, it's just been amazing there.
How many people are at that particular interpreting agency or organization you were talking about?
Well, there's about four of us leaders, and there's about 15 to 20 interpreters, and from many different tribes among us. Oh, and also, the question for those that didn't see it was the Indigenous Organization for Interpreters, IOAA. It's a regional organization, and the four of us set it up. Two of us are deaf interpreters, two are hearing Indigenous interpreters, and the four of us make up the whole organization. There's about 15 to 20 of us there, and it's called IIO, Correction to the Interpretation. So now, I was very much involved in the Indigenous community and have been, over the last 10 years, I've been giving my heart and soul into raising awareness and giving back to our deaf community. And it's very important that they have awareness of our Indigenous stories. And so, for example, the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women is an incredibly important organization, and we need to bring awareness to the deaf community so that they understand what's happening with our Indigenous community and the troubles we face here. And many thousands of times in the deaf community, people are inviting the wrong people to misrepresent our Indigenous community, and that has to stop. We keep on getting people misrepresenting us, and they're doing egregious harm to our community. You need to bring people in who have the real lived experience, who know what they know, who can respect our tribes, our identities, our backgrounds. And people need to listen to our stories. There are so many things that the deaf community misses out and not honoring and knowing the Indigenous stories and histories. And of course, we're Indigenous, but we also need to marry our worlds, the indigenous world of our Indigenous experience and of our experience. It's hard work to bring them together, but my daughter is deaf. I'm bringing her up in a world that doesn't have role models for her. Who does she have to look up to in the world? And so now my daughter does have role models. The people that are here tonight in your panel, there are more deaf Indigenous people that are coming out, and we need to see them. You need to see them. We need to stand together, and all of us together.
Okay, again, well, I just want to say that I'm feeling goosebumps from this conversation. I mean, I can relate with you three personally. Of course, we want to make sure that our entire Indigenous community, our Native American community, comes together. We can't marginalize certain groups and kind of pick and choose, our community. That's not evolution. That's not a village interpreter correction. So now we have a chance for some a question and answer, and I just want to open it up to folks who want to ask questions.
Okay, if anybody has a question, we have two deaf interpreters that will mirror your question, so for the camera and for the rest of the audience to see. And for our Zoom audience, if you have questions, use the Q&A feature there in your Zoom, and our host will pick one of those questions and the CDIs will translate them into ASL. Thank you.
Okay, any questions from our audience? Come on up. So I have a question. I'm sorry. Laureen told me to come up here and copy some. I didn't realize we had two deaf interpreters sitting right here. All right. So my question is, oh, what happened? You guys changed the interpreters. Okay. Didn't know that. Okay. Next question.
Well, I saw one of you share something. I am from an Indian tribe myself, from a lost tribe. And I can agree that sometimes it could be difficult to go to the library and find history about my family from my tribe, from Wisconsin, including my great 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 grandfather. So, my question to you is, what is your advice on how I can start my own research, my own discovery, my own identity? Where do I begin?
So one member of my family is in a similar situation and lost their identity, won't accept their native identity. The key is really asking a family member who knows um, some of that information and be able to really just find a last name that's accurate and then search through the historical records. Because yeah, you're right. There are issues with that when there's a small amount of Native American blood in your family, and being able to trace that lineage back. But it's important to find those names and search for those lineages. The best you could do, like I said, is really finding those last names and searching for that. I mean, I have a cousin who looks fully white, but if you look back, their grandmother and my grandmother as well are actually the link that provides that Native American blood in our family. So, if you're a quarter or a half, I mean, it's important just to do that research and then just expose, yourself or your family members to the history. Check with historical records and check with the historical archives that are out there.
I just want to briefly share that growing up, I always had some sort of instinct. I had a feeling, seeing in the movies Indian references, cowboys and Indians, and the powwows. I was always so excited to attend, and I always had that gut feeling. So, thank you for the tips and advice that you shared on how I can do my own research.
Do we have any other questions from any other audience members?
Hello, my name is Tashina Lin. I am also a part of the Indigenous community. I am
MAID.
MAIDU. I'm from the Madu tribe in California. Similar to the previous audience member, I am also a part of a lost tribe. I've tried to ask my family for some guidance on how I can learn about my history. The issue that I face is that my grandmother does not know how to read and write. I do have an aunt and a great aunt who I try to communicate with and collect information. But the issue is, with me being deaf, it's difficult to communicate. So, how would you advise that someone who's in the deaf community, living with hearing family members, get involved in tribal rituals?
Well, get in touch with the relatives, get in touch with people in the region where your relatives come from. As Mike said, look at your last name and talk with your grandparents and try to get names if you can. That's helpful.
My good friend is actually very similar to you. And, you know, just like you were saying, wanting to have that connection and having a hard time you feel because of your deafness, really, it doesn't matter. I mean, my sister is a hearing person, but still signs quite a bit. On my father's side of the family, I just asked for that family history and would ask. And my family member would just make the call for me and was willing to interpret for me. You can find somebody who knows you, who's comfortable being with you and interpreting with you, and could ask those questions or could help you answer those questions. So we have another question over here. So I actually just want to make a comment about that question, actually. So, people often ask me questions about my family lineage and so forth and how they would find theirs. And I always say one thing. First, you have to do your own research, number one. Secondly, today you have genealogy tests that you can take using DNA or using your spit and saliva, and it's a genealogy test. You can find your family lineage, and that's really the key to knowing your family history and your family story. If you want to know more, if you have more questions about that, it starts really with yourself and doing research yourself before you start bothering other people and asking other people. You need to start with yourself, because really a lot of the people around you don't have the answers that you're looking for. You have the answers that you seek, but we certainly learn from other groups, other people, and really it starts with powwows. It starts with storytelling. For example, we had a question that we saw from the Zoom chat. One person wanted to ask all of us here. They were saying that they see, you know, all the variations of signs for indigenous peoples or Indians, and they were asking what was there an official sign for Native American or Indian, or is it just personal preference, or what is it? And that was one of the questions we saw actually from the Zoom chat. It was a question. So for me, I mean, I could answer that for myself, certainly, but I'm curious what our panelists think.
Well, I'll answer that. Now, just remember that we all have and come from many different languages. In our indigenous world, we speak many different indigenous languages. So we can't be expected to all have the same signs and the same way of signing. I identify myself with this sign for indigenous, and some people use the old sign for Indian. And honestly, I don't want to be the one to tell other people the sign they should use, but I'll tell you my signs are Meskwaki, and that's what you call me. That's what I am. So Native American or American Indian are labels given to us by governments on race boxes to check on a form, but we don't use that. I call myself Meskwaki. You can call us by our tribal names.
For me, my family have used
Peloton Confederacy.
the Peloton Confederacy and Rappahannock. That Indian tribe name was used in the past. However, I mean, you don't have to say that. You could just say Rappahannock. You don't have to say Rappahannock tribe. So yeah, people today just tend to call themselves Rappahannock. But there are changes. I mean, in the past, that particular identity was tied to the word Indian, and that word can be an oppressive word and mean an oppressive experience or oppressed experience. But like I said, I mean now we just call ourselves Rappahannock Indians.
And also, I want to be really, really clear about the sign for indigenous. That indigenous doesn't only include Native Americans. Indigenous means people who are not Christian necessarily, who speak their own language, who have their own religions and cultures. Like Russia has their indigenous peoples. China has peoples that are indigenous to certain areas there. New Zealand has their indigenous peoples. So just to clarify, the sign indigenous doesn't only mean people from North American tribes. And let me say, I identify as Anishinaabe. And then in the past, our people used our tribal name. And then when we were colonized, that's when we started to go by words like American Indian or Native American. That you saw that evolution. And so we took on those names and titles, but we don't have to do that. That's why you see a movement now to going back to the names of our tribe. I am Anishinaabe. And if people ask me what that is, then I can say that's an indigenous tribe because we don't practice Christianity like they said, and like we no longer practice the colonized ways. We are a people that still exist, that are still here, and sometimes I'll use the sign, that one sign for native, but not this other one that people reference because that one is clearly comes from a history of colonization and a name that was attributed to us. And if you read your history, you'll find that the Christians and the Spanish and the conquistadors and they came over and tried to make us honor their gods and not the gods we honored. They tried to wipe out our tribes and our languages and our religions. And so, as an act of resistance, I don't use that term. Did you have something else you were going to say, Mike?
Thank you all for that. I also want to mention that the sign for Indian, that particular sign has been used for many, many years in American Sign Language. Is that a bad sign? No, it's not. It's just that we learned that particular term from the deep past. This particular hand shape, I mean, it's an F, probably, right? It looks like an F. Again, if I sign I am an Indian, I would not sign it meaning I am an Indian. I would sign I am Navajo. I am Dine. I am the people of all nations. That the things that I tend to say, but I would never say I am Indian or I am indigenous. Those words are not words I would use to describe myself, but I would say I am First Nation. Why would I say that? You may ask. The word America itself, I don't feel symbolizes who we are as people. When you say that I'm an American Indian, it causes me to really kind of recoil a bit. So I disregard the American part. I say I'm First Nations. Another question that I saw in the Zoom chat was from a hearing individual, a hearing indigenous person, and they wanted to know how me, as an American Indian, how can I support and foster deaf indigenous communities? And really, joint service organizations. And Sarah's interpreting program or interpreting agency is one of them, as an example of one of them. So, that question came from the Zoom chat. And again, it was a hearing individual that wanted to know how they individually, as a hearing person, a hearing indigenous person, could help and foster this community that they see here in this webinar. So their question was very specific in terms of how they, as a hearing person, could participate. So,
Sarah here, and we definitely need more hearing indigenous interpreters. Yes. And hey, out there, hey, if you're hearing and indigenous, we need you. Come join our organization. Come be an interpreter with us.
so, anyone out there who really, really has, a full life experience, an indigenous experience, if that's what you want to call it, is part of other organizations. I mean, we have an organization which is for Native American deaf individuals. However, you are welcome to set up your own organization or join another organization.
And it's sad to say this, but hearing people typically are part of different systems, and they generally have a great deal more access and resources. So it's fantastic. If you want to get involved and come help us as an Indigenous deaf organization, yeah, help us write those grants, help set up connections and recommendations for us. And that's helpful. Help spread our message. And you can donate, you can sponsor us, you can help our young people, especially our youth, especially our youth. We need more young Indigenous people helping and exposing our young Indigenous kids. They need the resources, they need socialization, they need to be around more deaf Indigenous people. And if you're hearing an Indigenous and you've got resources and kids, hey, bring them. We need more.
Next, I'd like to invite the audience to share any questions that they might have. Is there anyone in the audience who has a comment or a question? Audience member, first, I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I'm appreciative of this event also being streamed on Zoom. Now, Sarah, you had shared a word, which was colorism. And with that, I'm wondering if you can expand on what that word means in case there are others in the audience who are unaware. I'd also like to have you expand on how colorism impacts us who are residing here in the United States. And I'd also like to ask if colorism relates to the word pretentious.
Or synonymous.
Okay, shall I go ahead and answer? Okay. So, yes, I've learned about colorism because I've experienced it. And when I was a little kid, people would make fun of me for being so dark skinned and they would mock me for it. And then as I grew up, I started to see how lighter skin came with an idea of those people being prettier. And so I saw this throughout my childhood and growing up. And then just being out in the world as I've gotten older, I've understood the word more too about the pretendian, the idea of the pretendian. Any of you know what the pretendian is? Okay, so the pretendian is a person who has no native roots, who has no lived experience as a native person. So, for example, a white person who says, "Oh, yeah, 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 you know what? Um, uh, you know, I've read a bunch of native book writers, or there's somebody claiming to be native that's written books on native indigenous stuff, and then they're taking a, a platform over using that as a pretendian, and then like there's no legitimate claim.
Like a wannabe, so to speak.
Exactly. People that are like taking from our books and taking from our opportunities and taking from us are harming our communities. And it happens often. And a lot of times because of colorism, they will get more regard and more attention and more resources than us that are more native. And so they end up stealing our resources. I don't know, maybe somebody else can explain it a little better. Well, I can tell you that I grew up with a strong Indigenous community and knowing my identity from a very young age. And so there's an authenticity that comes with my story. And I am deeply traumatized by some of this experience. And that feeling is it's so profound. Right. We know it when we see it. We know it when we see it. Yes. And the experience of colonization has affected us deeply. And so when some pretending gets up there and mimics our experience, that is painful. It feels as though it just rips at all we've been and all we've lived. And so if you have grown up on the res, for example, you experience the harms of alcoholism, abuse, and rape and sexual assault, molestation. People that haven't had that experience that want to go up and speak our stories for us, that's what we're talking about. That's a bunch of bull and get out of our way. Like we have hands-on experience telling our own stories. We should be the ones telling our stories and nobody else should. That's why indigenous people have had the lived experience. It's their story to be told. Exactly.
So, as an example, I'm sure that some of you would rather read a book written by a deaf person if you're reading about a deaf story or deaf history, right? That applies to a lot of different identities today. For example, movie films, if they're fake, so to speak, I mean, it just doesn't have the same impact. My wife said the same thing, talking about First Nations crimes, actually, talking about that experience at boarding schools and people actually stealing that identity or claiming that identity for themselves to garner sympathy or whatever, or actors almost stealing these identities, stealing these stories to garner sympathy or get sympathy. And again, for it translates as well to deaf individuals who are native, wanting to hold and have control of their own stories in the same way. Most importantly, I think really you have to have the cultural authenticity to be able to tell these stories. It goes back to what you mentioned about the pretendian. A lot of times we see about in Hollywood with movie companies just stealing stories without any crediting of who lived these stories.
I don't know if you've seen this really famous commercial of the Indian sitting in the canoe as some white person is littered into their rivers. That person wasn't native at all. It completely fake, and yet they gained great fame off of that commercial.
So, really, the key here, the key point to answer some of your questions. When I walk through the world in general or walk in public, and somebody comes up to me and nudges me and says, "Hey, are you a Native American?" They're not saying, "Hey, are you deaf? Or are you Mexican? Are you..." The first thing they're seeing is Native American. That's what I get that sometimes. Um, I mean, what does that mean to me? So, first, it means, you know, you want to acknowledge the person that you're looking at. Do your research too. I remember, very well a particular memory where I attended a certain spiritual event. There was a Christian there at this indigenous event or this Native American event. There was an interpreter there as well. But the first thing I did was I nudged my friend and just said, "Who is this guy? I mean, this guy is not a medicine man. He is not." And we were apprehensive. And the elders all looked into it and later found out that, look, this guy was a fraud. This guy packed up his stuff and was gone. He made a bunch of money and was out the door. So, again, my point is simply do your research. And secondly, try to acknowledge the background of the individuals that you're talking to before just going ahead and making assumptions. Lastly, never marginalize anybody within our village. If an individual knows something about the community, bring them in. If an individual is from a different tribe, bring them into your community. If they have a different language, bring them in. So we are a symbolic village and we take care of each other. So now I wonder if there are any more questions. It seems that there are not, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up tonight's talk. I want to just thank everybody here. Did we have a hand? It seems like maybe we had a hand. I mean, we have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Bobby. Now, I'm curious about your indigenous ways, the way that you all meet, communicate, organize your community events. Now, when it comes to the westernization of way of being, I'm wondering what impact that has on you and your organizations, and also nonprofit organizations. I'm sure that they are handled much differently than they are organized within the Indigenous community. So I'm curious your perspective on the way that they go about things. What are your thoughts on that? And also, what changes do you want to see? Do you feel that they should implement or consider any changes?
I mean, I can try to answer that. I would like to see just the Indian ceremony or the Indian way of aligning in a circle. That's so similar to the to really just deaf culture of being in a circle. Um, there are parallels there in the deaf community and in the Native American community, and I think that that is something I'd like to highlight.
Also, I'll say in Minnesota, there are public schools now that allow medicine people to come into the classroom now. And that's fantastic. In my time, you never saw anything like that. And in Gallaudet, now, I would love to see you add that. You know, it's all right to our religious practices here. So a room for the medicine people to come. And I know you have one for the Muslims for their prayers. And we have the right to practice our religion here too. And I would love to see that. And when we gather for meetings, we can educate you too on how we do this. We can share these things with you. You can learn from us. You don't have to do things the same way they've always been done. You can invite others who can lead in an indigenous way.
Just to clarify as well, um, you know, being officers in an organization is a way to support your organization's an ideal way to support an elder organization by being an officer in that type of system. It just, but without the hierarchy, it's just a way to support each other, a way to have dialogues. I've seen it myself in hearing um, organizations which were just the same, but there were no interpreters there. But now thinking about, how we can change Western approaches, we certainly can. Very much the parallel in regard to deaf culture and circling up. It's just changing approaches and reminding people that there are different ways of doing things.
One more thing I want to say too, though, is that in the public school in Minnesota that I said, they have native educators come in and educate the students. And I never saw that when I was growing up. That just wasn't, but in high school, I remember somebody coming in and doing a little bit of that. But having native educators is so important. You need some people that are truly, authentically and native, who have grown up in the life, who can expose your students to this and like offer scholarships, things like that, and see what you need because what you need to bring those people here because it's important. And I'll also say that, Gallaudet could also partner with
Say it again, Haskell.
Haskell School, I think, and
University.
Haskell University, because that's a university for Indigenous people in Kansas. And so that's a really good partnership. I think you can work with Haskell University is another one. Yeah.
Yeah, I second that.
Now, Bobby, to answer your question, as an alumni of Gallaudet University, for years, I've tried to teach the Indigenous way of being, and I can share one example. There was a time where one of our alumni decided to give a beautiful donation to Gallaudet. It was a buffalo named
Tatanka.
We call it Tatanka. I was really happy that that particular alumni gave that gift. The Tatanka, the bison, is Gallaudet's mascot. But my question was the Tatanka, was the bison a blessing before it was completely killed?
Was the thing
Was-
blessed before it was put here on
Was blessed before it was put here on campus? Interpreter correction.
or was it simply just put here without that kind of regard? And that's just not the way to resolve this. It's not the way to learn this. And so to do that, to learn and truly benefit from this, you must be open, open of mind and heart, and you must bring people in to show you how to do this. How is it supposed to be appropriately done to bring that mascot here? How would the indigenous people do this? Don't make assumptions about how this should be done. Don't just decide it out of hand. If you're planning to do a powwow, well, you better involve the deaf indigenous people in the community to do this. Bring the elders, invite the medicine people, invite the chiefs. That is how you do this in an authentic way, and you can authentically learn. So, yes, it would be wonderful if we had more deaf indigenous people here with doctorates. That would be fantastic. But again, we don't have all of the same opportunities to get the Office of Vocational Rehab to help pave the way for us. Even though, we show that we're indigenous and we have proof of that, we don't always have the same ways of navigating those systems to get that access. So again, if you're asking, what can Gallaudet do for us? Well, first of all, be authentic with us. Secondly, be open, truly open to us. And then when you're out there and you're going to the Indian colleges and going to the res, go there, go to those places and tell them this is a place for you to come to. We need to make them feel welcome here and comfortable and know that when they come here, they'll have the support they need. Because we don't get that opportunity often. It's rare. So once again, thank you. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. You have been fantastic here tonight as a panel. Thank you to all of you here.
And really quickly for our participants in Zoom, if you can click on the poll icon, there's a survey there for you all to respond to. For folks who are here in person, we will be handing out the survey via paper and pen. So please take a moment to fill that out. Your responses to the surveys will help us tremendously in planning future events.
So before you all leave, I would like everybody just to, if I can get everyone's attention, I know we wrapped up, but before everyone leaves, if everybody could just, you know, take a look at these signs that they're using for good evening. They all have a different sign for it. It's kind of neat. And if you all could just want to just show everybody the signs for good night from each of your respective tribes.
Judy, can you share the Lumbee tribe's way of saying goodnight?
In PISL, it is signed it this way.
I don't know actually the way we would sign it. For us, I would sign an ASL, say good night, I love you. All right, good evening. End of show.